The UK is reported to have turned to Japan in its search for 5G network technology. But can anyone fill the Huawei void? And what does it mean for the timeline of 5G services? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Now, the UK is reportedly asking Japan to help build its 5G infrastructure. It's seen as a major blow for Chinese technology and a win for US President Donald Trump. The UK says it's banning China's Huawei 5G from its networks. The British government says the decision wasn't easy, but is right for national security and the economy. The move comes as the US intensifies its campaign against the tech giant, and it reverses the UK's attempt in January to allow restricted use of Huawei equipment. From the end of the year, UK operators will not be allowed to buy the firm's 5G kits. Gear already in place will have to be removed by 2027. Well, this is what the UK's Digital Secretary had to say.
The new US measures restrict Huawei's ability to produce important products using US technology or software. The National Cybersecurity Centre has reviewed the consequences of the US's actions. The NCSC has now reported to ministers that they have significantly changed their security assessment of Huawei's presence in the UK's 5G network. Given the uncertainty that this creates around Huawei's supply chain, the UK can no longer be confident it will be able to guarantee the security of future Huawei 5G equipment affected by the change in US foreign direct product rules. To manage this risk, they have now issued new advice on the use of Huawei in UK telecoms networks.
Well, China is accusing the UK of colluding with the US to hurt Chinese companies. It's warning it'll come at a cost.
Without any concrete evidence, the UK used the unfounded risks as an excuse and cooperated with the US to discriminate against, suppress and exclude Chinese companies. The UK blatantly violated market principles and free trade rules and breached the relevant promises they made. The wrong decision seriously damages the interests of Chinese enterprises and severely impacts the basis of mutual trust in Chinese-British cooperation. China strongly opposes this.
The UK's decision raises questions about whether other European countries will follow suit. US President Donald Trump has been pressuring allies to exclude Huawei from their networks. Some have already dismissed the firm, others are considering doing so. Trump says the tech giant could be used by the Chinese government to spy on countries. Huawei denies the allegations. Trump's already imposed an outright ban on the firm in the US and introduced new rules to disrupt Huawei's ability to manufacture its own chips. American visa restrictions have been recently imposed on employees of Chinese technology firms deemed to be human rights offenders. Trump says the race is on for 5G and the US must win it. Huawei is part of a wider economic and political dispute between the US and China. The two countries have been engaged in a trade war and imposing tariffs on each other's goods since 2018. They agreed on a first step towards a truce and signed a trade deal in January. China promised to open up its markets to American goods in exchange for a partial lifting of US tariffs. But tensions resumed soon after the US accused China of suppressing information about coronavirus. Beijing rejects that allegation. There are also at odds over China imposing a national security law in Hong Kong, Uyghur Muslim minority human rights violations by the Chinese government, and Beijing's claims in the South China Sea. Let's bring in our panel. We have joining us from Adelaide, Australia, Simon Lacey. He's a former Vice President of Global Government Affairs at Huawei Technologies in Shenzhen, China. In Chamonix, France, we have Robert Pritchard. He's a cybersecurity consultant and former deputy head of Cybersecurity Operations Centre in the British government. And in Tokyo, we have Mark Einstein. He's the chief analyst for digital services at ITR Japan. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Mark in Tokyo. So, Can even giants like NEC and Fujitsu fill the void by shunning Huawei, as the UK is doing?
So they absolutely can. I mean, NEC is not incredibly successful overseas, but is the #1 supplier to the #1 company in Japan, which is NTT Docomo. And Fujitsu's telecom business has not really been very strong in recent years, but they just won a big deal with Dish in the United States. So while they might be more expensive and less inexperienced, I do think that from a technological perspective, they would be able to fill that gap.
Simon, do you agree with that perspective? Has everyone been making too much of a fuss about whether or not there is life after Huawei in the 5G world?
Well, I think there's definitely life after Huawei. I mean, you've already got some vendors in the space well established like Nokia and Ericsson, and Samsung has actually long been the sort of company to watch in this space. But look, I mean, NEC is coming from so far behind. It's hard to really see how it could really change the dynamics in the UK market. I mean, if you're talking about the UK market, now you're going to have fewer vendors, less competition, and you're also delaying the rollout quite significantly, and that could have some serious long-term implications on sort of the competitiveness of the UK. But this is a decision that the UK government has now taken, at least for the foreseeable future, and they'll have to live with that.
I could see Mark shaking his head in, I guess, disagreement. What do you take exception to? Isn't it a fact that NEC, like others, they are pretty much everybody is behind Huawei?
Well, I mean, in terms of market share, yes, I would agree that Huawei is the #1 player in the global telecom infrastructure market in the world. But I think that NEC has been, the main supplier of NTT Docomo, which has been the pioneer in 3G and 4G services and now 5G services. So to say that they're behind technologically, I think is incorrect. To say that they don't have anywhere near the footprint of Huawei is correct.
All right, let's bring in Robert if we can. Robert, there is a belief that aside of the argument of whether it's possible to go on building a 5G network with or without Huawei, that this decision anyway is more motivated, the decision of the UK, for political reasons rather than real cybersecurity concerns. Is that how you see it?
I think in part, probably yes. The NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, changed their posture, as you said in your introduction, from thinking Huawei was a manageable risk. And then after the sanctions that the US announced, they decided that because it restricted Huawei's access to technology, that they wouldn't be able to maintain an appropriate security posture. So I think there's probably... I think that's legitimate. It's fair to say that if you are denied access to some of the cutting-edge chip technologies, then you probably are going to struggle, at least in the short or medium term, to keep your products up to date. But I suspect there probably is politics behind this as well. There's obviously been a lot of pressure from the US, and I think there's, as again you said in your introduction, the deterioration of the relationships with the national security law in Hong Kong, which obviously is of a significant concern to the UK government, as well as the Uyghur situation, I'm sure would have had influence. All right. Simon, you mentioned there that this kind of move means the UK is going to have to push back its rollout dates, or it's going to delay 5G technology. By how much? Well, I mean, UK officials have said that this could be, anything from sort of 2 to 3 years. Some in the industry think it's going to be longer. I think it was BT that went on record and said there's no way that they could rip and replace their Huawei equipment in the time frame set. But this is going to be a significant setback for the UK. I mean, you have to think that the countries that are really pushing ahead with all the sort of the IoT applications and the sort of fourth industrial revolution are Korea, Germany and Japan, and certainly Germany and Korea were not about to let their competitiveness be impacted by any sort of delay in 5G by
by adhering to US pressure on banning Huawei, which is the most cost-effective, the most technologically advanced competitor in the space, at least right now.
That's interesting. So we're looking at perhaps some countries being years behind. Mark, will this effectively then create a two-tier world when it comes to 5G technology? Those using Huawei and those who don't, who are maybe 2-3 years behind the others?
So I do think that we might see something of a 5G Cold War where we have, countries that are willing to accept Chinese technology and countries that aren't. I certainly, clearly Huawei will continue its, innovation in China. It's very strong in the Middle East and certain parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. That's going to continue. I think the real battleground is going to be in continental Europe, where it's about 50-50. So that's really where we're going to see this war, I think, as it's at its hottest.
This war, Robert, is supposed to be about cybersecurity. At least that's the official reason, right? But have any of the Huawei alternatives been subjected to the same sort of rigorous testing that Huawei products have been subjected to make sure that they are more secure?
No, they haven't. That's a fair comment. So the Huawei in the UK has what's called the Cell, this cybersecurity centre, which is staffed by vetted UK individuals to review the code. And they found lots of problems in Huawei code, although they've never found a smoking gun that says they were put there by the state. But clearly, none of the other players have been subject to that kind of review. But that said, I think it comes down in some levels to trust. Yeah, it is, but equally, I think we should expect that as the other players become more prominent, they will be subject to review, and of course, people do security reviews of equipment as well. It's perhaps just not quite as public. The Huawei, the security reviews of Huawei, the board make an annual report, so we know roughly. They don't necessarily provide all the detail, but we have an inkling of the kinds of security issues that they're seeing, and it's not atypical for a large enterprise telecommunications kit. It's not a sector that has a stunning reputation for security generally, for a variety of reasons, one of which, of course, is the longevity of the equipment. Once it goes into your network, it's there for a very long time, and new vulnerabilities are found and new technologies come along. So I think that you'll have it's more of a degree of trust, though. I think even if you find the same vulnerabilities, you may have more trust in Nokia or Ericsson or a Korean company, I forget who we were talking about,
Samsung,
not exploit those. Samsung, yeah. So they may have a bit more inherent trust in those organisations to fix those and perhaps not exploit them in the same way as one might worry that Huawei would.
Simon, looking at the bigger sort of global picture, the picture that I think you used to have to look at for Huawei, is the UK decision, can we call it a decisive victory for the US in the battle against Huawei?
Well, I think, look, nothing's really decisive. This decision has gone back and forth several times over the last year, and last year we had a very sort of evidence-based, transparent telecom sector infrastructure review with dozens of experts from all across the spectrum that came and testified, and the decision was taken. The finding was made that Huawei didn't represent a risk that couldn't be mitigated, and now we've sort of gone back the other way. And I think, look, you have to be realistic that a lot of this is due to. I think it was Robert that alluded to some politics, and I think. You've got one set of political factors in the Conservative Party in the UK, and then you've got another kind of elephant in the room in Washington with a president really fighting for his political life and stepping up to China and becoming more belligerent towards China is just part of the American presidential silly season of politics, and I think. Once we get to November and January, we might find a new reality, regardless of whether Trump is re-elected or we have somebody else in the White House.
Well, explain the last part, if you could, Simon. I can understand if there is a change in the White House, but why regardless of that?
Well, you have to look at it like this, right? So, I mean, if let's say Joe Biden gets elected, he's going to get elected on a platform that's also fairly aggressive towards China, but I don't think he's going to try and eviscerate any of the Chinese sort of national corporate champions. If Trump gets re-elected, he's going to have to reconcile with China, just for the economics that represents, and he's going to have to get his phase 2 trade agreement passed, and he's going to have to engage with China constructively. And
so, do you see some of these restrictions being rolled back, Simon? Ultimately, is that what you're saying?
Well, Trump has always treated Huawei just as a negotiating chip, and he's always also shown that he's more than happy to throw his national security people under the bus if it's politically expedient to him. So I think this is something that he could roll back on, sure.
Mark, does it then, given the political sort of environment which Simon was explaining there, does it become a lot more commercially viable for companies to invest now in competing with Huawei 5G technology that we're seeing the UK, possibly others, might ban Huawei 5G? Does that help companies to think about investing more in competing, or do some of the political calculations about whether it's elections or other things on the horizon really limit that?
So I think that there's a few points to consider here. So one, it is very early days in the 5G network deployment. So there's still a lot of base stations are going to be that are up for grabs. There's a lot of money up for grabs. We've really lived in a Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson world for many years. I do think that there is room for more players regardless. So, and I think another issue, clearly there are geopolitical forces at play, but Huawei is very keen to point out that it buys $19 billion worth of U.S. components every year from companies like Qualcomm and Intel. And I think that, should we ever see these restrictions rolled back, it might have a lot to do with these companies raising their voice. So there's also a commercial aspect in addition to this geopolitical aspect.
Robert, the U.S. decision to restrict the sale of some of those advanced U.S. components that Mark was talking about there, the chips to Huawei, does that create kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? With more Chinese components and less non-Chinese components in the Huawei 5G network, the US can make a stronger argument for the security risk of Huawei, right?
Yeah, I think you could probably say that, although it's worth considering where all these components are manufactured anyway. And I expect for 90% of them, even though the company is American and the development is done in America, the manufacture will be done in China. Yeah, it could be that. Equally, it might push Huawei into the position of developing this technology itself. And if there's something we've seen over the last, 10 or 15 years, I first have heard of Huawei in 2005 when they were quite niche telecommunications provider, and now they're this massive global behemoth. So they're certainly not short of funding and innovation capability. So I'm sure they will step up to the mark. I don't know how long it will hold them back for.
How is Huawei faring then in coming up with an alternative to the US chips?
I honestly, at the moment, I really couldn't say. I'm sure they will have seen the writing on the wall, though. It's not like the relations have been entirely rosy over the last couple of years, and as I just said, the Huawei has and the Chinese focus has been the sort of domination of these markets. So I'm sure they will be looking to have domestic alternatives. I'm sure it would have been on the roadmap anyway to try and move away from American companies, or at least move the American companies' manufacture to China. So they will have the fabrication plants already. So I don't think, and probably a lot of local and domestic know-how anyway. So whilst I appreciate that designing the next generation of these things is a massive enterprise in itself and requires a lot of specialist knowledge, I can't really believe they'll be too far behind the curve.
Simon, there were reports the US is offering money to other countries like Brazil, which want to build a 5G technology network, as long as they shun Huawei, obviously. How worried do you think the Chinese should be at that sort of policy?
Well, I think, the Chinese, have massively deep pockets to sort of fund, the outward expansion of their companies, and you know, I mean, there have been reports of export financing in previous decades, which is one of the things that allowed Chinese companies to get market share. Although Western vendors also benefited from those sort of arrangements from their home governments. But I think, you know, if you're asking who can outcompete the Chinese Treasury, can the US do it? I guess, I mean, the US can print money, right? But you know, that sort of thing is very damaging ultimately, because it really distorts markets and it distorts incentives and these sort of things. I mean, in Latin America, Huawei proved quite successful at gaining market share. And what a lot of people forget is that AT&T has a network in Mexico and it's 70% Huawei equipment, right? And nobody's ever raised any security concerns about that, even though it's just across the border. So I think, you know, this claim that Huawei represents a cybersecurity threat, it does kind of misrepresent the threat to a very great degree. And the reality is that there are several states that have really formidable capabilities in terms of hacking and breaching networks, and China just happens to be one of those countries.
Simon, I'm sure you've heard
capabilities
the
are really
common
network
comeback
agnostic.
to that
Yeah.
is that Huawei has these much closer links to the government, even to the Communist Party, is sort of comeback claim to that than other companies.
Not really. I mean, not really. If you look at how closely the big American corporates are tied to the US government, and that goes for companies like Boeing, Lockheed, Honeywell, but also AT&T and Verizon. This is a highly regulated sector, and so, you know, you can have a philosophical discussion about whose companies are closer to their governments, really.
I want to bring Mark in. What do you make of this? Is this the UK decision something of a point where the tide is turning? Do you expect others to follow, other countries to ban Huawei from their 5G networks?
Right. So I do think that, you know, there's a few points that need to be made here. I think when we talk about security risk, we need to be very clear about cybersecurity risk or supply chain risk. And in, you know, my opinion, the decision in the UK was largely driven by the concerns that Huawei would not be able to fulfill its contractual requirements because it couldn't get components from the US and Taiwan, et cetera. That's very different from an espionage cybersecurity kind of problem. So I want to be very clear about that. So I think that, you know, with that in mind, I think that there's a few countries that you want to watch. I mean, in Germany, Huawei's done extremely well with T-Mobile. I would watch that very closely as a bellwether to how some of these European countries that are on the fence are going to go. I think India, because of political tensions between those two countries, might be another area to watch. And then again, we have aggressive lobbying in countries like Brazil. But I still think that Huawei is going to continue to be a major global player in China, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in many of these emerging markets, as you know, we've already discussed. Right. In Mexico. You know, Huawei's cost competitiveness really has enabled mobile broadband to proliferate much faster than it would have without Huawei. I think that's a very important point.
Let me take that point in 40 seconds, Robert. Does Mark have a point there? Huawei's going to be around for a while. Even the UK ban doesn't ban 5G upgrades or Huawei in 2, 3 or 4G networks, right?
No, it doesn't, and there is a lot of Huawei kit on the 2G and 4G networks, and indeed on the fixed line. And just to go back to some of that risk, I think some of the cybersecurity risk was legitimate, but perhaps has become less so over the years with the different architectures. But no, I definitely don't think they're going away anytime soon, and they'll be around on the UK network well past 2027, I'm sure.
So you got to wonder how serious all of this is. Thanks so much, gentlemen, for coming in and joining us in that discussion. It's been a great show. Let's thank Simon Lacey, Robert Pritchard and Mark Einstein. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.